This
Hello,
guy.
everybody. Hey, Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Actual Play Broadcast. Today, we are reviewing Mothership, a short adventure that Zemian recently GM'd for all of us and is already available for your listening pleasure.
Yeah.
We are short one of the players. Life stuff happens, but we want to get this review. That way, we can sit there and give our thoughts on the game. And all in all, I think the game is, fairly well designed. It's a little on the lighter side, at least on the player's perspective. I don't know about what all the background shenanigans you had to worry about as a GM.
I mean, not a ton. So I have mixed feelings about the game. I do like it. I think it's
Yeah.
neat. I the big problem I had with this game was that every time I came back to it, I felt like I had to relearn how it worked. And I know part of that is we had huge gaps in between recording.
Mm-hmm.
But also, even when there wasn't a huge gap between me looking at the rules and stuff, it just wasn't sticking in my head for some reason. And I'm willing to accept that's a me issue. I don't know why. It's not like I hate the game or anything, just it wasn't. I kept having to go back and look at stuff.
Here's my counterpoint on that.
Mm-hmm.
We also had significant gaps between sessions for things like Wrath and Glory and I almost said Fire Team and Alien, the Alien RPG. Significantly easier to still come back to those. And for Wrath and Glory, that's kind of saying
True.
something, because Wrath and Glory had a lot more shit that you had to remember.
True. It was
Bulkier,
like
one
once
bulkier.
I do remember when we were looking at Wrath and Glory, it kind of came back to us pretty quickly when we did a quick refresher. Whereas I don't know, it's not like Mothership is complicated or anything. It just I don't know. It just wasn't clicking in my head.
And I don't know if that's a fault of. There's a part of me that wants to blame the system, primarily because I don't know what else to point at. And, that's kind of difficult because the system itself isn't very complicated. But I think the bigger issue isn't that it's not that it's easy to pick up. It's not memorable.
Yeah.
Like we all
That's fair.
really like the Alien RPG. Wrath and Glory we're all pretty happy with. And we were able to like, oh, that's right, that's how this works, good to go. The only thing that's really different, other than like potentially the time difference that isn't super major, is how each of us felt individually about the system. The most memorable part of Mothership to me is character creation.
I agree
Fair.
with that.
Because it does things a little differently. So, core concept of the game, Mothership, it's a horror-based RPG. Primary with a not really a focus on any combat or anything. It seems more investigative. I don't know if that is fully the purpose, but based on the rule set provided, that's how I would look at it.
I feel like if you're going to do a horror RPG, it's probably going to lean more towards investigative. Like, can you have combat in this? Absolutely. Characters are not, I'm going to say, as fragile as characters in Alien, for example. Things are still lethal, absolutely, but the impression I have, which it could be wrong, we didn't really have much or any combat for the most part. And, you know, so my opinion might be skewed. But I feel like characters in this game could probably do a little bit more combat, potentially, depending on what weapons are being used, what armor is in play, stuff like that. But considering it's a horror game first, yeah, I think the assumption is because I did read some stuff. I remember, I mean, shit, over 6 months ago now at this point. Um, some stuff that was said by the developer, I believe, and they had said, stealth wasn't in the game as a skill because they didn't like how it's usually utilized. Essentially, was my takeaway from what they said. That people often just go, I roll stealth, and suddenly your character is functionally invisible. Instead, they wanted to encourage players to be like, I'm going to go hide from the monster. Okay, well, what are you going to do? Well, what does the room look like? And you actually describe what your character is doing to hide, and then use that to intuitively determine whether or not the monster is going to see them or not.
I don't know how I feel about that take, but we're not here to review the take.
Right.
Yeah. All I'll say about that is I appreciate the line of thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do. I can see why you may not like it, and I'll leave it at that. That might be something to talk about in when our yapper episodes about running things.
Yeah.
But considering that this idea of hiding was a major aspect that was actually thought about for the design, I'm inclined to believe, hiding, investigating, and less fighting. Because most horror games, fighting the horror is not generally your first move, your first attempt to handle anything. So I think it's safe to say investigation is probably the default mode of play.
Which, my past experience with games like this is running things like Call of Cthulhu, playing in the Aliens game, uh, and I think this game comes at the same genre, but doesn't stick the landing.
Okay. Why do you think it doesn't stick the landing?
It doesn't feel like it does a whole lot differently for it to stand out as its own game. It
Interesting.
has it has its own like sanity mechanics, which I think are neat. It has its own saves, but it doesn't offer like any new spins on the genre.
Fair.
Yeah.
Uh, personally, past experience with these kinds of games, running Alien, I've also dealt with, trying to shove horror into Pathfinder effectively, which certain kinds of horror can work, but in general, not really. Doesn't really work. You can tell a horror story, but it doesn't quite hit the same than a game that is actually designed for horror. But I mean, I think this game does do horror well, and I think maybe why you have the opinion you do, Brandon, is because it is set up to be a generic rule set designed to do horror in space, and it is up to you to kind of fill in the blanks.
Gotcha.
I think that might be why, because making the obvious comparison from what we've had on the podcast, Alien. Listener, as well as those of us that are here, I mean, if you crack open the Mothership book versus the Alien book, and don't get me wrong, the Mothership book does look nice. It's well put together. It does have good art. Not the typical art you would expect to see in an RPG, but in my opinion, it's good. But compare that to the Alien book, and even in our review, we called out how the Alien book, just opening the book and flipping through the pages, evokes the feeling of the setting. Just flipping through the book feels like Alien. And then you get the character sheet, and it's got the whole Weyland-Yutani logo on it. It has, these very like in-universe designs to how the sheet is done up. And all of the mechanics are very thematic to Alien, where they really capture the experience of going against xenomorphs. Whereas Mothership is, here is all of this stuff. Here are all the rules. Some art here and there. It's very much, I don't even want to say it this way, but it's very much a system that is a means to an end of telling horror in space. And I will commend it. It's one of the things I like is that when you get into the this is the wrong book. There's one of the books for running the game. There is an entire table for generating a random horror adventure, essentially. Which I didn't use, but I love having tables like this. And I wish more games did these kinds of things. Especially for like very low level beginner, like almost tutorial mission play when you're taking your group through a game for the first time. That's so wonderful to have because then you don't need to sweat about designing an intro adventure. You can just be like, yeah, fuck it. Let the dice decide. And you can just have something very basic. But I think that might be the contributing factors. Alien had a very solid through line and feel because it is a very specific thing, and they did knock it out of the park for capturing the franchise in those pages.
So let me ask this question because I haven't looked at the running the I'm for lack of a better term DMG.
Yeah.
Uh, in that book, does it give any? It's just like here are some optional rules that you can acquire that you can add to the system. Here's how if you wanted to add this to the system. Like, does it go over like adding more to it, or is it just expected for like, hey, here are the rules for how our generic system functions. Make the rest of it up.
So it's definitely a toolkit for running the game. I don't remember it talking about optional rules. I do remember it talking a lot about here's kind of the DNA of an adventure. Like he gives you those tables and stuff, but then it also is like, here's how you do your, your starting scenario. Here is kind of how you pace it out. How do you break this thing up into chunks for like the different parts of the story where it's like, okay, you have your beginning, and then the generally like this thing happens, and then there is like, the first encounter or whatever, and then there's the dealing with the thing, right? And then kind of break that up into like acts or whatever. And they kind of talk about like characters as well, like how to make characters that fit for like a certain game, as well as like I think they had some stuff about tactics in there. They also had a section talking about puzzles. Um and it was just very yeah, actually I'm scrolling through it now. There's a section about maps. Um but I don't personally remember there being stuff about optional rules. There's a lot of detailed running this game in particular, as well as some stuff of things to not do. Like they did talk about safety tools. I do remember that being in there, which is fine. It's generally a good thing to talk about, to be like, hey, don't be an asshole to your players. But okay, so I did find one. There is a section talking about what is a house rule. And it talked a little bit about interpretive rulings, procedural rulings, and systemic rulings. And then a section about how do you make a ruling. And then it goes on to talk about social encounters. So literally, like, house rules took up 2 pages. And that was it. And there is definitely a degree of the writer putting their own thoughts into how to run a game on here. Like, I didn't read this thing cover to cover, so I'm just kind of like scrolling through. But you know, there's, like you were talking about earlier, about not necessarily being a fan about their opinion on stealth and such. There are some spots in this where you can see like the writer's opinion come through. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because sometimes we as readers do need a very explicit, here is the writer's voice saying, hey, here's the deal. And just spell something out. Because sometimes we get, especially in like these larger products, we don't really get an individual writer's voice. We get a very, in a way, obfuscated way of saying something. And when that happens, there are times where we have to interpret or try to decipher what exactly the meaning was, because it is so focused on being proper or what have you, rather than, say, conversational, if not direct. But like, I will say this: I do think the as the book is called, the Warden's something. I think it's the Warden's Guide, or no, sorry, Warden's Operation Manual. I think for a new GM, it's useful. And I think the section specifically about running this game in particular could be useful. But if you are looking for some more advanced insight into running games, you're not really going to find it here. There are some good nuggets in here, especially when it comes to talking about horror and such. But ultimately, this is a 59-page book of here's how to run this game in particular. So to answer your original question that spawned this entire thing, yes and no. There is some stuff about house rules. There's not a lot.
Which
There is not really a guideline to modifying the game. There is here is a bunch of different monster ideas, and in a way you're kind of encouraged to build out these monsters in whatever way suits you.
and my issue is that with it being a generic system, or at least how that it seems to want to function as a generic system, I feel like it's missing the depth needed to be a good system. Not saying it's bad. It's
Yeah.
just I guess it might just be like a fully personal preference thing.
That's fair.
Um, but what's the game wanting? Ollie, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, it was just more of a grunt of a agreement.
Yeah. I will say, while we're on the Warden's Operation Manual, page 7, phenomenal piece of full page art. Fantastic. Just like cyborg horror thing. It's like a skull with like a glowing eye, and it's got cybernetic enhanced arms and legs and more mechanical pieces coming out of its back, and it is like tearing open either a woman or a long-haired man. And it's graphic, but it's fantastic. I love it. That said, I did read part of the book for, part of the operation manual for running the game. And there was definitely some useful insights into it, but like as somebody who's ran some horror stuff before and has also just GM'd a lot of stuff in general, I didn't personally feel like there was a lot to glean from it. Some of the stuff seemed kind of obvious. Some of the stuff were decent point outs for how Mothership plays. So your mileage may vary. I will say, running it, I simultaneously felt confident and unsure most of the time because it didn't feel like with running Alien, it was very explicit. Like pretty much whenever you feel like, give the player stress. When they encounter the thing for the first time, when they see something horrible, blah, blah, blah. Mothership kind of had similar guidelines, but it didn't feel as explicit to me. And so I was a little light of touch in the first couple sessions because I didn't want to lay it on too thick, too fast. And I don't know. I also, because like the rules just were not clicking in my head, I was a little cautious to go full tilt into a combat.
I don't know. I don't know if the game wants you to do combat. That's the part I'm unsure of.
I don't think it's against you doing combat. I think it's just if you're going to do combat, you got to be ready for people to die.
Yeah.
So as far as playing and running is concerned, I'm just like, I would almost want to take some ideas presented in this and then just rework Alien a little bit. Because I will say, I do, from the running perspective, I do really prefer how stress and panic work in this. If they were just a little bit more explicit about how quickly you could or should build up stress. And then, like, I like how when it builds, how you roll the d20 and you're trying to get above whatever your current stress value is. And as that stress builds, the potential results get worse. Plus, there's more results on that table. And so I like it overall more than the Alien chart, because the Alien chart was a little limited. And we kept getting the same shit over and over and over again.
I'm sorry that I roll like dog shit.
I mean, it wasn't just you; it was everybody.
Yeah,
I
I
feel
know.
like
Everyone kept fucking dropping shit out of their hands.
Yeah.
And like how playing the game felt okay. I felt like there wasn't enough to do. It's like, what can I do? I can make a skill roll. Okay. Oh, you know, what kind of skill roll am I gonna make? It's like, well, you're gonna look around the room. Go around the room. I get what I get from that. And then, there's nothing there's nothing else that your character can really be doing. It feels like you're being led by the nose.
Yeah. Yeah, the player characters don't have, in a way, a lot of personal power. Like you said, they pretty much have skill rolls to make, and that's ultimately the start and end of what they can do. And it's worth noting the system strongly suggests you only roll when failure can actually mean something, because when you fail, you can gain stress. So, in our playthrough, if you listen to it, there are times where somebody suggests doing a roll and I say no and I just give them the information or just tell them or narrate or whatever. Because in those moments, at least to me, it wasn't worth rolling because it wasn't going to lead to anything interesting. But, if you're in a situation where it's not high stress, you're not in a serious situation that is you're constantly pressed for time and fucking up just about every roll could be costly. There's not a lot of reason to roll dice, which then means you're going through a good chunk of a session, if not all of it, without rolling at all. And for some people, they're going to hear that and say, that's great. And for other people, they're going to hear that and go, that's not great. Because people have different opinions on what they want out of a game. And I mean, I'm not going to go into this whole conversation. It's something to be had on the other show, but some people like to say one way is better than the other. And it's not really the case. It's a matter of preference. Some people like to do more of just a narrative with some light engagement with game mechanics. Other people like a little bit more game with their narrative. And some people like a little bit of narrative with their game. And that's okay.
That's okay. It's whatever suits your table, whatever
Yeah.
everyone's all right with, as long as no one's don't be a dick. Golden rule.
Yeah, like me personally, I kind of agreed in those moments of like, I want to call for a roll. But then in the back of my head, it's like, well, the game told me don't do that. And so, yeah, it kind of, I felt like I was fighting my instincts running this game at times.
Okay.
All right. But yeah, your thoughts.
Overall, it wasn't entirely sure what to make of the game in the first two sessions, realistically. Like, there was definitely the sense of exploration, getting our bearings with what's going on in the story of, well, this is our mission, this is where we're supposed to go, this is what it's like when we get down to the planet side. But really, a lot of the horror aspect kind of came in on our last session, and I liked how that horror came out. There was
That's
definitely a lot more suspense. There was definitely a lot more feeling of, well, characters' reactions to this, characters' reactions to that, how we worked a little bit better with each other on our reactions in doing or interacting with the story. There was definitely a lot more, at least from my perspective, a lot more feel that the horror was actually present.
yeah. I had more planned. The
Yeah.
so I even said it in our first episode. I had planned for it to go for 5 or 6 sessions. There was going to be more of a like slow burn build up. Well, not even more of a slow burn, but it would have been a more gradual build up instead of the sudden ramping up in the third session. And more things would have happened and gone wrong, and you would have eventually been forced to go down into the cave.
Right.
But between scheduling and other shit going on, and then missing so much sessions and stuff like that, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up.
Right.
Need to put a bow on this. But like, I mean, I'm glad people enjoyed it, despite it's a little bit more rushed ending.
No, I enjoyed the third act. It's just that it felt like this system. I felt like we got to do more in that third act. I don't know if the system's like, hey, save all of the action for the third act, because it recommended how to
Not
do.
particularly.
Okay.
It did kind of. I'm trying to remember it. It. I think it was like broke it up into like 5 or 6 parts, essentially, something like that.
Hmm.
And I like it. It of course did the thing of like, okay, you have the introduction, and then you actually are like, you start getting hints of the danger, and then like the danger appears. And then there's some other part, I can't remember how they described it, and then there's essentially like beating the thing, and then I think that was the idea of like the final shot of the thing may not be destroyed or whatever. It was very horror movie tropey in its
Yeah.
layout, but it was definitely, there's room to have combat outside the final act, so combat could be a thing. But in this specific case, with the type of monster I had, it would be more about fighting like possessed people than the actual horror itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because
Which
I
made
was
sense.
I was on a kick of alien space ghosts.
Oh, that reminds me, because I didn't think about asking this until
Mm-hmm.
after. Why were people fucking transforming?
Side effect of the space ghosts. Pretty much a really advanced case of them merging with somebody. Because they can do weird shit to the body more than just pilot it. They can poke and prod things and exert an influence over it.
Going to custom my glove so it fits a little bit nicer.
Kinda, yeah. And
Okay.
so that's why he wasn't turning into anything in specific. He was just weird. Kinda had scales, kinda had spines, kinda had, the extra finger, what's the point of that? But, it weird, because the entire conceit of these entities that have no name, just in my head, alien space ghosts, they have no act, like they're not literally ghosts. They are entities that exist on another level of reality that we don't understand.
More
They
Cthulhian.
don't, yeah, like they don't understand what it means to be physical. I was stealing that idea of like, we have no idea how to comprehend what it would mean to be a fourth dimensional being. Like, we can guess at it, we have theories, but we don't have a way to like fully conceptualize and entirely grasp what that would be like. So in that same way, they cannot conceptualize what it would be like to be a living, like, in a sense, three-dimensional living animal. It's entirely alien to them. But they're curious. And they want to invade into this space for reasons. And I, specifically for myself, left the reasons vague because all that mattered is they want to. That's all that's important to the story. They want to. There doesn't need to be a reason. And honestly, it's even scarier if there's no reason. They're just doing it. In the same sense that insects just killing other insects, in a way. You could sit there and say, oh, it's O for survival, or it's instinct, or whatever. But as thinking people, we might look at behaviors and other things and be like, there's no reason to do that. But they do it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, point is, I didn't develop a reason for it other than that they wanted to be here. And they've had a long strain of just wiping things out because they keep trying to get in. And of course, living things are adverse to being invaded.
Imagine that.
Yeah. There is definitely more I want to do with them. It may not necessarily be in regards to Mothership, but I do want to explore the concept more, and I've like a very tiny bit have started cooking on building a sci-fi setting to do Worlds Without Number. Or sorry, Stars Without Number. I get the two fucked up in my head because I think Worlds, because space, but Worlds Without Number is the fantasy game. Stars Without Number is the sci-fi game.
Yeah. But, and you've touched on it a little bit, like how it feels to run the game.
Mm-hmm.
Any more insight on that?
Not really. Like I said, it's got some tools. It has some options. It does have a lot of tables, and I will give it this commendation in the player survival guide, sorry. The first page, at least in this PDF that we got, is the weapons and damage and armor table, reference tables. Which, even though we didn't use it much, my God, that's beautiful. Like opening a book and having a quick reference in the first page, phenomenal. I adore that.
You're likely opening
games
this.
Need to adopt this.
Yeah, you're likely opening this book because you need to check something.
Is it as dramatic of a build up to the first time reader opening the book and going through those first few pages and getting to the table of contents and seeing everything laid out before them? No, it's not as great for that, but that experience is a one-time thing. Like, the rest of the time opening that book is going to be checking the rules, having those rules quickly accessible, and thus being at the front of the book. Amazing.
Yeah. Quick reference guides are always nice, and people spend a lot of time online making those.
Yes. And there's a lot of game masters that make their own for games that may not necessarily have any, or they don't like the ones that are available out there. So they make their own. But yeah, nothing more on running the game.
things that we liked about the game. I generally like horror games. I think they're fun. I think they're a fun way to explore both the horror genre and the RPG genre. The I have hangups with the system, but there are good things with the book itself, such as, like we already said, the quick guide. Character creation is fun. Character creation is engaging because you're already making decisions in there. I would have liked to see some of those decisions matter a little bit more, but that might have been because I was playing an Android and my big thing is, it's really hard for you to fail fear checks or fear saves. It wasn't really a thing I ever fucked with because I never went towards the things that would cause fear because the mission parameters are get the doctor, get the data, get the fuck out.
Yeah.
So it was might be an issue with what I was doing, and I'd be willing to accept that. I think I did myself a disservice by playing a Android. Um, Not saying that you shouldn't play an Android. I'm just in our situation, you know, I don't think I was better for it.
Yeah. And it didn't occur to me that it would potentially affect the experience in that way. So I didn't think to advise to not.
And it'd be hard to say that that would pop up because it also comes down to like player decision. If I would have, probably explored a bit more, been a bit more nosy as an Android, we probably would have seen those things pop up. But again, you know, I was playing my idea of a company Android. It's just like, what are my orders? I do those orders. I do things that facilitate those orders. Um, Curiosity is a flesh bag problem. But your Android may not, when you go to play it, your Android may not be like that.
Yeah, you're not required playing an Android. You're not required to be very mechanical or very objective minded necessarily. You can play a very human Android. Yeah,
What about
I
all?
mean, I'm gonna echo I like the way the panic system is done. It's definitely overall better than Alien's panic system. Um, and I do appreciate that it is an open ended, more generic system where you could sit there and build out your own setting around the rule set, and you can build out your own monsters and stuff. That's always nice.
That is always nice. I do agree with that. Anything you particularly liked, Ollie?
Honestly, it's just more of how Zemian was just running it, and then us being able to interact with the suspense and thrill, especially in the last session. Because on one hand, it was definitely hilarious on the military and therefore more combat focused person whiffing their hits.
Yeah.
But given the fact that we were also taking stress from this situation and that situation, or encountering this and becoming more stressed and freaked out, it also fully went in with the vibe of this was a horror thing. The characters are not having a good time.
Yeah, you're not steel nerves, badasses. You are, just some people out here trying to do your fucking job.
Just
Mhm.
some dudes.
Just some dudes.
Oh, yep. So I do kind of like the D100 system for how they had the stat set up. It was kind of interesting to work with. Definitely does kind of give more of a feel of like a normal person interacting in a difficult situation. Um, Dealing with the stress, or at least having a panic attack or some sort of that nature, was kind of interesting because it's based off a D20 roll in our current level. So, I mean, none of us actually panicked in the game, so I don't know exactly how that happened or how that would have really occurred, but it was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I
I think we had one close call for a panic. I think.
Yeah, I think it might have been me.
I know Dami failed one of his saves when he got locked into looking at the mirror.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he failed. Got stuck looking at the mirror at the elevator. Um, Luckily, he was able to save a second time and succeed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, because I was not too thrilled if my character Gia had to sit there and go through a failed sanity check or panic attack. Because that meant for anyone who's ever watched Red versus Blue, Control FU.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it kind of like leads me to like the things I didn't like about the system.
Okay.
Well, I struggle to understand why D100 and D20.
You know, my my only thought is that so it could be a clean chart of you have up to 20 points worth of stress, and it's a 1-for-1 for the roll and the result. Because if you did it as a percentile, you would either have to reward multiple stress points if the chart was going to go 1 to 100, or you would have to have a portion, you'd have to have a whole new column on the chart that would have a conversion, essentially, where you'd roll a D100, and if you had these results, and then you compared your stress value, and then you would look to see what the result was. I think that's probably why it is, because otherwise it would be a multi-step way to determine results.
And see, my thought on why they did it was that way they could use the advantage disadvantage concept. And that didn't sit right with me. Um
I mean, advantage, disadvantage applied on the percentile rolls as well.
I don't remember that, but I may not have interacted with any
It
of the
didn't
changes.
come up in play, but advantage, disadvantage was something you could affect on a percentile roll, if I recall correctly. Which I was also kind of like, yeah, I don't really feel like that's necessary.
Like, The concept of advantage disadvantage is neat. I don't think it needs to be in every system, but we're seeing it pop up in more and more systems.
Yeah.
So it might just be something
Yeah.
I have to get used to.
I don't think you have to. Just not play the systems that have it if you really don't like it.
Yeah. But, you know, I've already voiced like I don't feel like there was a ton to do, but maybe that changes depending on, what you do for the story or how the story is, you know, laid out and what all the acts are and what people were, what matters people try to force. It could even come down to the kind of character you play.
Yeah, if you're gonna run this game, I would definitely heavily advise, you put in a lot more things that are check worthy according to what this game considers check worthy. So I don't know. Put them in a situation where that you have to roll a lot more things. You know, maybe it's a use the Dead Space example. Maybe you're on a ship that is decrepit or falling apart or whatever, and you're constantly having to fix things along the way or move stuff or what have you, and specifically make it stuff that they're gonna have to roll for. Because otherwise, yeah, you might end up having situations where your players aren't rolling very many dice, and if your players like to roll dice, well, you're gonna want to give them reasons to roll dice.
Yeah.
That kind of goes with what I don't like. I Like I said before, I felt like I was fighting my instincts on this game because there were times where I did want to call for a roll and it was technically not appropriate because it was something where if you guys failed, uh, it wouldn't feel appropriate to give stress for. So I just kind of skipped it, and I don't. There are times where I don't mind skipping game mechanics, but then there are times where I really don't want to because we are playing a game. I am a game master who very much likes having game in my role playing game. I'm all for RPGs being a vessel of telling stories, but at the end of the day, it is an RPG as in game. I want to have mechanics. I want to use mechanics. I want to engage with mechanics. I don't like feeling like I have to fight myself to run the game the way it wants to be ran. This doesn't jive with me very well. So that's kind of my big gripe. That combined with the rules just did not seem to want to stick in my head. What about you,
But you,
Ollie?
Ollie.
No, I don't really have much else to add, really.
Fair?
It definitely just felt more like a lighter system, which on one hand is not too bad to work with, but at least from what I remember with the first two sessions out of the three we had, really wasn't a whole lot to really do. Or at least I didn't feel like there was a whole lot to really do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Zemian said, uh, there were times where he was like fighting the desire to say, "All right, roll for it." Um, but there are good ways for a system to go, you don't need to roll for this. And there are, ways that it could be done a lot better.
Yeah.
I don't think this
Like,
system nailed it.
Yeah.
like I'm all for like foregoing perception as a skill. If you're going to design on the assumption of when a player enters a room, anything that is obvious is clear to them. And then if they are actively searching the room, it is assumed that they're turning everything over. Or they're explicitly describing how they're looking around or whatever, and that it doesn't need to be a role. And like I can get behind that. I've had a GM in the past hit me with where I've asked like role perception and they didn't say anything, and it's like, okay, well, we're gonna try this, we're gonna try that, and it's like, oh god, you guys should have rolled for perception. And it's like, I asked, you didn't say if we could or not. Like, and they would withhold information until we rolled for perception. And like that's annoying. If it's something fucking obvious, just tell me. Um, but I can still see making rolls for searching for stuff. And so I there are lines of thinking where I can somewhat agree on foregoing rolls when they're not necessary. I do it sometimes in my own games where something's easy enough or there's no real not even necessarily danger, but there's not really a risk of failure, or failure wouldn't even really be interesting in any real way. I just forgo the roll sometime. But that's something I personally have prefer to have the power and the ability to make that decision rather than the game like heavily dictating this is when you should or shouldn't make a roll, because saying you shouldn't make a roll unless it makes sense for a failure to give stress really kind of constrains things. Because then it's not really a you decide when a roll is appropriate. It's are you going to give a fail result worthy of gaining stress? Because stress is a very meaningful failure state, effectively. You have a meter that is building up.
It feels
That
like
if it
the
gets
only
high
failure state.
enough, well, I'm talking just failure state and like this is a tangible, like this is going to be a problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Because sure, we could talk about a failure state as in like, oh, well, technically just failing a roll is a failure state. Okay, sure. But this is you fail a roll, it's going to start snowball affecting because now your stress has gone up. And if you go to make a panic roll, the more rolls you failed, the more likely something terrible is going to happen to you, which is on theme for a horror game. Don't get me wrong. But when it comes to deciding whether or not players should make a roll for something, the system is forcing your hand. Because if you're somebody who ideologically is like, no, I want people to roll because I want them to be actually like playing and rolling dice, then you're going to cause them to build up stress unless you make that executive decision of, well, if they fail, I'm not going to give them stress. But then you're changing a core element of the game at that point. And that's a decision you have to make for yourself because you are going to be fundamentally changing part of the experience of the game.
Yeah. I have. I don't know how to phrase it. It's. It feels like it wants you to add more stuff to it, but then, like you described, it doesn't exactly give you the methodology to do that.
Yeah. This doesn't really have the benefit of being built off of a popular system. Like, this doesn't have the benefit of, like, OSR, for example, where a lot of OSR games operate off of the same D20 system. And typically anything that is like OSR compatible will be compatible with something built off of the OSR. Like, is it crazy hard to modify this game? Probably not. But you're probably going to do a little bit of work on your end to make changes or adjustments.
So I think the time has come.
Yeah.
Well, actually, hold on. How would you recommend improving it?
I honestly don't even know because I feel like any improvements I suggest would just dramatically change what the game is. Like I would maybe offer more guidance on rolling and stuff and maybe provide some optional rules on and like just a more deep dive on ways you could or may not, as in skip using stress and stuff like that. Because I think that you could have times where you say make skill rolls and not necessarily gain stress for it. You know, for example, trying to make a knowledge chest for some information to try to recall something or to make sense of something, you could do that and not gain stress for failing that roll reasonably. Like it's not hard to stretch. It's not a big stretch to think of tests where a stress just wouldn't be appropriate result of a failure. And I know there are some people that have some strong opinions about fail states with failing rolls and stuff like that, and I'm not going to get into that. I personally think failing a roll is part of the story, but it also doesn't need to be something hand waved unless stress is involved. I think
Yeah.
just a more thorough storytelling book probably would go a long way with more tools and such.
In my opinion, I would move this away from being a generic system because, I mean, it's a rule that gets put into just about every RPG. Specific trumps generic. And I feel as if that rings true here, where it doesn't feel like the game does anything for itself because of the fact that, it's a generic system. It doesn't have any of its own fully tangible rules. It has its concepts that it wants you to follow, but I don't feel like it's its own game. I feel like it wants you to make another game using its rules. And I I think it does it a disservice because it's a cool concept. I think it could have some legs if done properly. I just don't think it was done properly here.
That's fair. I think it I think it being open ended for you to kind of like shape your own stuff around it is nice, but I can understand why you might feel that way.
If it provided you more tools, I'd feel differently about it. to where you could add more rules to it.
Fair. What about you, Ollie? Anything you would change to improve the game?
Not entirely sure. Because realistically, we didn't really get to dive into using a whole lot of our skills or whatever the skill tree system is for this. So I think that's realistically the only thing I'm kind of not sure about. Because even with using the combat abilities that's listed for the characters, which is pretty generic for the system, it just seemed kind of interesting with the D100 system. Because like it was a little on the swingy side of, well, character missed, and then other times character didn't miss. Probably a little bit more, that's more so swingy feeling than even like D&D.
You felt that it was more swingy than D&D?
Yeah, but it's also, as far as I remember, that was basically the only time my character and I actually had to interact with using the skill tree and skills. So I
Okay.
feel that I feel that there's not enough interaction to have enough to really suggest anything to change. Especially because it like for me, it feels like we didn't even utilize that aspect except for a few things at the end of session 3. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to really explain it. It's just the fact that from the little experiences of working with their skill tree and skills listings, it's interesting, especially how they're supposed to interconnect at higher levels, but with what we were able to use and utilize for our sessions, it was almost non-existent, really.
Yeah, which goes back to my issue of fighting over whether or not to ask for roles internally.
Right.
Because as GM, I get the feeling that the game doesn't want me to ask you guys to do roles unless I'm ready to start compounding you with stress. And in those first 2 sessions, a lot of things that would have been roles didn't really feel like they would go for stress, except for, Oscar doing the math in the notes as an example of like, yeah, actually, no, this is going to stress out your brain. Go ahead and make a roll because this isn't going to make any fucking sense.
I am a computer. This does not compute.
Yeah. And yeah, I rubs me wrong because in general, I don't like systems that are like, minimize rolling dice. It's like, not a fan of that.
Then let's go ahead and give our final verdict on the game. Does it have a
Yeah.
spot on your shelf?
it has a PDF in my personal RPG folder on my computer that I may or may not consider pulling out every once in a while if I want to do something very generic sci-fi horror.
Agreed.
I would not put it on my shelf. Um, I would I would hesitate to give it a um rating of a PDF. I'm not the biggest fan of it, and there are other horror games that it's like if I were to have a fresh hard drive and didn't already have it installed, I wouldn't look to download this. It would not be on my list of things to go grab.
Fair.
What about you, Ollie?
Um, I'm in the same boat for both stances. It seems kind of interesting to have a very generic sci-fi-ish horror story to kind of work with if we want to go that direction. So a PDF would be kind of nice. But I'm also in the same boat as you, Brandon, where if the only reason I would do the occasional bring it out for maybe that one or two, the few sessions we do for a generic sci-fi horror, because we already have it. Otherwise, I wouldn't go out of my way to get it.
Yeah.
But with that in mind, well, what other systems would people recommend?
Alien.
Alien's an easy one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
like even to some extent, you could probably even reskin a few things and refluff a bit of the alien, and you could still get it probably close to a generic sci-fi horror.
I imagine there is probably some kind of sci-fi or space add-on or hack for Delta Green or Call of Cthulhu.
Oh, absolutely, there is.
Yeah.
You don't have to do too much to hack them, to be honest.
I imagine
Um,
not. It's a matter of skin and flavor.
yeah, it's just like, especially for Delta Green, which has a lot of weapon rules already because of what Delta Green is.
Yeah.
It'd be more Call of Cthulhu, where it'd be an interesting time of, oh well, how does this play out for the sci-fi adventure?
Yeah.
Because that one's a bit harder to hack. That one has rules for like 1920s, but that's not exactly what we're looking for. But for Delta Green,
Also,
it'd just be like, oh, I changed the flavor, done.
I'm also going to go off the reservation a little bit here. And I'm going to actually suggest Trinity Continuum Aeon for
Yes, off the
space horror.
reservation.
Because while it's not natively about horror, I think you could absolutely run a decent little horror themed adventure. While the game is not entirely about horror, it does not have, panic rolls or anything like that. You could absolutely have some spooky shit in space with that game.
The game can get spooky.
Yeah. Other suggestions than that, there's not a ton of sci-fi stuff that I have in my collection here.
Um,
Uh,
if you don't hate the rule system, you could do Traveler.
oh, true. Didn't even think of Traveler. Yeah.
Eclipse Phase does horror well, but it is a more cumbersome system. It is not light by any means. The rest of our suggestions are a lot lighter.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, I can't just scrolling through my list here, I can't really think of any other recommendations.
Yeah, I don't really have much of any recommendations.
I was waiting for you to recommend Here Be Dragons.
Look, I mean, we could go into that, but it's not really as horror
Could
as
you do horror in it?
um with the way some of that stuff is. Yes, you could. Um,
I'm not gonna say what came to my mind.
like the one of the enemy types in Here Be Dragons is kind of otherworldly made manifest in our reality. So,
So in theory, yeah, but it's
yeah,
not. That's not what the system's designed for.
no, it's only a part of the system that you can go and explore, but realistically, it's just cyberpunk in space with furries.
There's the true horror. But any final words regarding Mothership?
It's all right. It's okay.
Yeah, like for another short session, probably another, let's say, another small campaign, 3 to 6 sessions, like Zach was looking for. That would definitely be another cool, fun one. I think realistically, it just would be the pacing.
Yeah, I think if I were to run this again, I think I would pull out the dive supplement and instead of explicitly just general sci-fi, do some underwater horror shit.
Underwater.
Yeah, they have a whole supplement called Dive where it's got boats and underwater equipment and stuff. And potentially doing something with that. But
Cool.
that'll probably be a while off. I've got enough game prep shit going on as is. Because I, at the time of this recording, am preparing for what I am running next to take over this time slot Mothership has been doing.
Have we reached a final consensus on what that is going to be?
I suppose I could announce it now. I've been holding off on telling anybody. But it is going to be Hunt for the Reckoning.
Hey, should be fun.
Oh yes, and no, dear listener, if you are initiated in the world of darkness and are aware of the Paradox 5th edition games, no, I am not talking about the poorly disguised Hunters Hunted game called Hunters the Reckoning 5th edition. I am talking about Hunter the Reckoning, the actual game Hunter the Reckoning, published by White Wolf. Take those shots for what they are. I have feelings, and in my opinion, my feelings are highly justified, regardless of how you feel about that. But we are maintaining our stance. We are not playing any World of Darkness 5th edition games in this podcast. So it is what it is.
Is what it is.
You know, one day Brandon and I might look at some of those in comparison to some of the older World of Darkness like game lines and have a conversation. But we are never going to have those as campaigns on the podcast because, quite frankly, nobody here will run them. So
Not Incorrect.
Yep. But yeah, so Hunt of the Reckoning is coming up. And Brandon also has his new game coming up.
I do.
Yeah.
Speaking of Aeon,
Yes.
I'll be running an Aeon campaign. One that I will probably realistically fumble the bag on.
That's fine. It's its
Yeah.
own little continuum. Don't worry about it.
It's not a matter of that. It's just I feel like I'm missing something from the story concept that I just don't know
No,
what it is.
we can talk about that.
Yeah. But I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you for hearing our opinion, and we hope to see you on the next one. Bye.
Bye bye.
Whoa.